Thank you all for being here. We want to get started with our panel discussion. Peter Slocum, whom you saw as the moderator for the show, will also moderate the panel. He's going to moderate it from down here because we have so many distinguished guests on the upper level there. Starting from your right, Dr. Dale Morris is the director of the New York State Department of Health, the Office of Science and Public Health, as well as a professor here at the School of Public Health in Epidemiology and Biostatistics. And next to Dr. Morris is Dr. Wayne Treiner, who's a professor of emergency medicine and an emergency department physician at the Albany Medical Center, and also on our faculty. Welcome. Our special guest, Dr. Young, Dr. Gus Burkhead, who's the director of our Center for Community Health and the AIDS Institute at the State Health Department, and is also an associate professor of epidemiology and biostatistics here. And last but not least, Dr. Brian Cherry, who many of you may remember from a previous Grand Rounds. Dr. Cherry's a veterinarian and also an epidemiologist, and is the assistant director of the zoonosis program here at the in the Communicable Disease Bureau at the State Health Department. So we have some questions already, but we really would like to get a lot of input from those of you in the audience with specific questions or concerns that the panel might be able to help with. Peter, do you want to come up here?
I would like to start by asking Dr. Young for any specific reflections on connections between the Ontario border and the New York border during the SARS experience. We heard a lot about WHO and CDC. Did you have state-to-state contact or province-to-state contact that was significant in the outbreak? And I know some of these people here on the panel probably would have been involved in that.
We certainly did, and first of all, as I mentioned, we had a good deal of contact with the CDC and great support from CDC on including technical support, studying some of the issues. For example, the healthcare workers infected in the hospital, they brought someone up, and we had someone from our federal government and people from the province and the municipality all study the issue. The World Health Travel Advisory caused contact as well. What happened with that, it originally was set up with the idea of being protection for third world countries. The problem was that SARS didn't do well in third world countries. It actually did very poorly in third world, and it did well in modern hospitals. But it meant that we were paying very close attention to spread, and we had 2 cases that spread to the United States, one to Philadelphia and one to, I believe it was North Carolina or somewhere. And we contacted people early and told them about that. But we had a number of false alarms as well. Particularly once the travel advisory happened, then we would get a phone call that someone had gone through the airport, and maybe then they had SARS. And the airport in reality is 30 miles from the hospitals that had SARS, and we automatically knew they didn't have SARS, but we would have to work through everywhere they had been and track through and then report back that they didn't in fact have SARS. The last of those, I'll just tell you a brief story before I quit. The last of those involved a set of Air Force flyers who passed through the airport on their way back from an air show in London, Ontario. And the week they had done it, Jeb Bush had been up earlier in the week from Florida to talk to us about SARS and learn what he could learn. So the CNN picked up these flyers, got sick when they got back, and reported that they were sick and they had SARS, and we had to try to get a hold of CNN and tell them that they didn't have SARS and to not be running the banner. What I was going to say to them was that the chances of them having SARS were much less than Jeb Bush having SARS, but then I thought the banner at the bottom would read Jeb Bush has SARS, so I decided not to do that.
Well, I remember at the time of 3 Mile Island, the emergency preparedness commissioners in New York were sitting around in the bunker out there by the state office campus and couldn't find out any information. They were reading the Associated Press Wire and the New York Times, and didn't know what to do, so they called up the White House press office, this is in 1979, and asked them how they were supposed to find out. This is the transportation commissioner and the health commissioner for New York State, what the heck they were supposed to do. And the White House press office said, I don't know, I'm reading the New York Times also. I mean, I think things are a little better than that now, but I don't know, any of you New Yorkers want to comment on the kind of information gaps you found yourselves in during the Toronto SARS experience?
Maybe I could comment that particularly in the western part of the state, along the Niagara frontier, we felt very close to Toronto and the epidemic, and in fact, it turns out there's a fair amount of commuter traffic across that border on a daily basis, as well as quite a bit of traffic in one direction or the other. Also, the cities of Rochester and Buffalo and Niagara Falls get Canadian media and Canadian TV and radio, so we often would get calls from them first saying, you know, we're hearing this, we're hearing that, what do you know? And we did have some contact with our colleagues at the provincial and also at the City of Toronto health departments, but we recognized that they were in sort of crisis mode and we tried not to bother them. We did rely a lot on the website for a number of the different Canadian organizations, which were great in being fairly up to date and posting information. So we did get a lot of information that way. We did actually have some spillover from the religious gathering that occurred that was mentioned in the previous talk, and we had a number of people who had attended that gathering who then came into New York, and we heard about them. I'm not sure what the line of communication was on that, but we tracked those people down, and I think it would be interesting, even though we had nothing like what happened in Toronto, we did in this country and in this state do a lot of follow-up on SARS cases, and we, in fact, in the end, by my tally, had about 52 suspect cases and 8 cases that met the probable case definition in New York. None of those ultimately panned out to have serologic evidence of SARS, but these were people who had traveled, had contact in the Far East, in countries with SARS, and had respiratory illness within a 10-day time frame. So they met the definition, the public health definition that CDC was asking us to apply. So as we get on in the discussion, we can talk more, but we did actually get involved with isolation, quarantine, testing issues, tracking people, and at least thought through a lot of the issues that they had to deal with more concretely in Toronto. But in terms of our proximity, you don't think of New York being close, but particularly the folks in the western part of the state, I think they're very close. We had one concerning phone call with one of the local health commissioners out there who wanted to block any transfer of patients from hospitals in Ontario into his county, fearful that they would bring SARS in. So those kinds of issues percolated throughout the several months that this was going on.
It sort of gives more life to what Dr. Young said during the earlier talk about recognizing that you're speaking to the whole world, not just the travel agencies around the world, but the health officials who have to track cases down. Were there any cases that showed up at Albany Medical Center or that you were aware of in that hospital setting?
No, Peter, we didn't have any confirmed cases. We were confronted with 2 Asian children recently adopted from listed areas. We run an adoption wellness screening type of clinic. So all of a sudden, we had a whole pediatric waiting room and clinic staff who were potentially exposed to children who potentially had exposure to people from potentially a listed area. And that wasn't potential enough because it just pretty much inundated our occupational health service and the emergency department for a period of about 5 or 6 days. And we were as confused as anybody else during that time.
Where did you get the information you needed to sort things out?
Yeah, it was actually, we were dealing with the websites, the CDC and the Ministry of Health websites as well.
Just Peter, that raises, I mean, we had actually the same problem, and it demonstrates how widespread the issues are, that they're not just health issues, but we had a large adoption program with China as well, and we had families from Ontario going, and I think there were 30 families going right at the time of SARS, and we had to make a decision as to what to do, whether to allow them to go or not. And in the end, we allowed them to go, but we quarantined them when they came back to Ontario. They were not happy, and one of them is suing us, in fact. But our point was our system was already more than strained, these kids almost all come back and they almost all get sick from the change in food and culture and the upset. And the symptoms are almost identical, and it causes mass panic, because when they get back, every family has a party to welcome the new person in, and so it shows you the thing just grows like topsy from an innocuous thing like an adoption, and we spent a lot of time arguing that one and deciding what to do as well.
In fact, I think adoptions were a big part of what we were dealing with as well. We didn't appreciate the degree to which the adoption trade goes on, particularly with China. So 8 or 10 at least of the cases suspects that we dealt with were in adoptees. And I believe it may have been even at Albany Med, where several of the pediatricians who originally saw the patients a week later were sick, and we actually asked them to stay home over the weekend until we could clarify. Asked them to stay out of work over the weekend, got chest x-rays, and in consultation with CDC and Albany Med finally let them come back to work. But reading what's going on in the paper and saying, we really have to be very vigilant about this, but how hard, how do you push when there's a lack of any protocol, really? So it was a difficult discussion, but we in microcosm dealt with some of the same issues that were dealt with.
Before we get into the quarantine and isolation thing a little bit, I wanted the laboratory work. Dr. Morse, did the laboratories here in the state get involved in trying to track down, isolate cultures?
Well, certainly we also have an expert in the audience that might want to add to this. I don't know if Jill Taylor, you want to add anything, but obviously the lab had to gear up very quickly for the potential of testing, and really starting with very limited information. But since we have an expert, Jill, do you want to comment on? I think it's.
I'm Jill Taylor, I'm Director of Clinical Virology.
Can we give her a mic so we can get it on the tape?
Yeah.
Here we go.
We may as well take advantage when we
It's
have
gonna be too long for me
somebody
to
who's on the
repeat.
front lines of having to gear up very quickly.
I'm Jill Taylor, I'm Director of Clinical Virology at the Wadsworth. And we set up a BSL-3 lab very quickly, and we're able to develop both conventional and real-time PCR tests. And we also cultured all the specimens that came in the BSL-3 facility. So I think we tested some 42, 43 of the 50 that Dr. Burkhead mentioned. And we now have our own in-house homebrew real-time assay, as well as the CDC's assay, and we have ELISA capabilities as well, if it happens again, which we hope it doesn't.
Obviously, there was tremendous pressure to develop some capability because of local hospitals and things that wanted some kind of backup service provided. So wondering how you handled the huge volume of specimens on a laboratory aspect, and then safety in the lab. Did that become a major question?
Yeah, we have a provincial lab system, and we geared that up and stopped doing a lot of other things and turned our attention to the PCR testing in the Ontario system, and did a very active lab linkage with the equivalent lab at the federal level is in Winnipeg. And interesting, the Winnipeg lab is the one in the world that has animal and human in the same location, which may be useful in the future. But it's what we discovered, of course, is the best and the most reliable testing were on people who had died, but it's not a great way to have to test. Wait till they die and then find out if they had SARS. But I think a lot of the work now is on figuring out when to test and what to test so that you get enough of a viral load that you get a positive test. But at the time, I think, particularly in the early days, the testing was more of a red herring and more of a problem than it was an aid. And I don't mean that critically, because everybody was working on it, but we spent a lot of debate and then did what we were going to do anyway, despite the lab test.
As you were saying in an earlier talk, the diagnostic work was very little use whatsoever, right?
Yeah.
Any other questions, please pop up at any time. Go ahead.
What role did rule-in testing take? So my question is testing for other pathogens as well as SARS. So you do the PCR, which would tell you it probably wasn't in that specimen, did you then reflex to rule in testing for other pathogens, and how important was that?
It was very important. When we got someone in, particularly if we were suspicious that it didn't fit SARS, we ran the panel, we ran it aggressively, and we ran it very quickly so that we could shut that area of quarantine and that area off. And we had people within Toronto Public Health, a couple of the people who were doing a lot of the contact tracing, really got good at figuring out who had SARS and who didn't. They heard it enough times and worked with the infection control people, and intuitively they were right almost every time. And so if we had somebody that we were worried about, we just rushed their stuff through so that we could eliminate it as quick as we could, and it was extremely valuable because of the fallout from knowing that it wasn't SARS.
In the back?
Does Canadian law restrict access to patient records as much as U.S. law does? Is it easier for you to do these things than it would be for us?
Yeah, it not only restricts access, it's probably as much or more, and confidentiality is a big issue. But what you find in something like this is it doesn't matter, because the longer it went on, the more the press had their sources within the hospitals, and as we all know, hospitals are reasonably leaky places for secrets, and the healthcare workers themselves talked among themselves because they were worried if somebody was away from work, they wanted to know whether or not their colleague had SARS, so they would, there weren't too many secrets in the hospital system. And so the press would ask me some days, does so-and-so have SARS, and we'd hope they wouldn't say the name, but very often they were hearing before it had made its way up to me. So confidentiality and privacy around information was very difficult, as was even sometimes, and I alluded to it this morning, racial data. Our initial cases obviously were in the Chinese community. The religious group were a different community, and we didn't announce that group because we thought it's going to lead to a lot of shunning of that particular culture. When we didn't announce it, the press were very critical of us for not telling the truth or not telling the group. So you're always weighing all of that and trying to keep it in balance, and yet you know, we had to do a lot of work that it was safe to go to Chinese businesses, because the first thing that happened in SARS was the Chinatown went quiet because no one would go. We got the Prime Minister to come to Toronto and eat in a Chinese restaurant to get people to literally to go to Chinese businesses.
Dr. Burkhardt, you want
Yeah, I'm
to
not sure if your
respond?
question was getting at whether the health department might have had difficulty getting information. And in fact, in the United States, even with our HIPAA law, there's an exemption for public health information. So we very quickly put the SARS condition on our list of reportable conditions, which under the state public health law allows us to access records and get information, and actually requires the healthcare providers to report that detailed information to us, and then protects it to some extent when it's in our possession. So there are mechanisms to be able to quickly gather the information we need for the public health purposes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Now, our SARS was made reportable almost I think it was 15th or 16th, and we have it set up so the Minister of Health can do it himself without a complicated either legal or political process. So he was handed the piece of paper right at the beginning. It became reportable, and then the exchange of information took place with public health.
You did a very good attack rate bar graph. Could you do a similar oral attack rate bar graph for how the elected officials moved over time on these issues?
It was very interesting because last spring was the lead up to an election. Our elections are not cast on specific days, and whenever the party decides to have an election, but the sense was we were heading towards an election, and we were really heading towards it when we got the power blackout, which really complicates the management. But interestingly, the day that I was on a phone call and decided that we wanted to call an emergency, I went to see the Minister of Health, and then I went to see the Minister of Public Safety and Security, and then went to see the Premier and said to them, we have an emergency. And up to that point in time, all they knew was we had closed one hospital. And I said, and it's not just a health problem, it's going to affect all of the province. They bought into it and they agreed to it, and within 2 hours of the first visit, I had the emergency called and we had them mobilized. They didn't understand it at the beginning, and to the credit of the Premier, he said to me, I'm not going to ask you to come and spend 2 or 3 hours a day explaining to me what's going on, because that's a waste of your time and you've got an awful lot of things to do. You do what you need to do, you spend the money and you manage this thing, and come and talk to me when you've got time. They did get more and more engaged. They took political heat for not being involved enough, and his answer always was, what value added am I? I'm only going to do what they tell me anyway. But the political parties were watching that, and I suspect in future, right from the beginning, the politicians will be, I hope not over-engaged, but fairly engaged. And but they were pretty good about just letting us do our thing.
What about
Oh,
the
the
mayor?
mayor, the mayor. Yeah. The mayor actually did stay out of Toronto's way mostly. He made the crazy comment about the who, who's the who. The mayor was at the end of his term and was actually not physically, had problems as well, and is sort of known as a loose cannon. It was the same mayor that called the army in when we had a snowstorm one time. So he tended to overreact. The good news was we made it a provincial emergency, so that took him out of the mix. So he didn't actually have any control over the situation, and that I was aware of the mayor from before, so I was aware that it was best to not be under his control.
And he did, and he, yeah.
It's amazing that you didn't have the political leaders that they gave the scientific people the lead and allowed them to, run the conferences. Is that atypical for Canada?
It's fairly typical. In the power blackout, we had a situation where the supply of power was an upcoming political issue, so they were more front and center. But what we've tried to do, and I think this is very important, is when we've set up our governance for the future, we've set it up in such a way that I'm the conduit between the operations and the policy, and so I clearly run the operations side, and then anything that we can't solve or where we're going to spend enormous amounts of money or there's a policy decision, I go forward, and we have a group of the cabinet ministers that are affected. During the power blackout, I chaired the cabinet, even though I'm not a cabinet minister, I'm a bureaucrat, and got answers from them and policy decisions, and then carried that back and had it translated into operations. So what we've tried to do in the model is say to the politicians, you should not be in the ground doing the operations and making the operational decisions or trying to run operations. Your job is the ultimate responsibility of the policy. We'll feed you that information, but stay out of our hair when we're managing the operations. And so far it's worked. And I think it's much safer to do it that way.
Somewhat similar to the structure that used to be in place, I don't know if it is anymore here, the Disaster Preparedness Commission at the state level, which had the commissioners from involved agencies, transportation, public service, health, and so on, and then this sort of a secretariat or an executive based in the CMO, State Emergency Management Office, which would try to carry out those decisions. But in my day, it wasn't as high level as Dr. Young's participation. I don't know, Dale, do you have anything to update that, or?
Well, yeah, we still have CMO, State Emergency Management Operation, and that would be called into operation if there was some kind of major event. And it's basically staffed with representatives from all the major state agencies, and then pulled in expertise around a particular subject area. So, but we have Bob Burhan's here and other groups and people that are involved with that process. So that's been mobilized for things such as the ice storm and other disasters that have taken place. And now that the State Health Department also has its own operation center that can be mobilized as well around topics that would only be health-related. So quite often there's going to be several centers operating, and it's going to be a communications question of linking those various centers to make sure that everybody's on the same page.
And the U.S. style also seems to be, in dealing with the press, that you would be less likely to have Dr. Young's person out front all the time communicating those decisions. I think the political figure would feel required to be there, perhaps to avoid the criticism that he or she wasn't involved enough, and or perhaps to get the credit for being engaged.
If I could just comment on that, during the SARS epidemic, I think one of the things I did every day was read the transcripts of Julie Gerberding's press conferences. She really did daily press conferences, and I think during SARS was really the face of the federal government and CDC in addressing it. So in that instance, I think it worked. She was scientifically credible, also reassuring, but practical in her comments. And I actually read those transcripts every day to get a sense of how, you know, we would be answering, should be answering questions. And I think at least in the case of SARS, it did work out that the scientific spokesperson was really the main one dealing with the press around it at the federal level.
And perhaps that unhappy experience with the anthrax letters where they didn't have the scientific CDC director out there speaking, and they had the Secretary of HHS at first, led them to do that. Question over here?
I have a question for Dr. Young, and this relates to the education that you provided for the hospital staff. Did you extend that education or anything else to other kinds of facilities, residential facilities like mental health facilities or nursing homes, or how extensive was that effort?
It grew exponentially. It started out, obviously, that our first concern was the hospitals, because we had the bug there and we had the problem there. It quickly became apparent that we had to pay attention to doctors' offices, but then it became obvious that we had to do bloodletting facilities and outside labs and x-ray facilities and nursing homes, so we broadened that out with time. It really turns out you have to do the education almost everywhere, and the sooner, and one of the lessons I learned out of that is to, another time I would bring representatives of all of those groups in very quickly and have them as an advisory side table, so that I can not only find out what's going on in their world and what the questions are, but use them to pass the information back through to their groups, because you end up eventually needing everybody at the table. But it even goes much broader than that. One of the things I didn't learn about till after SARS was that when people would be put in quarantine, the first thing they do is go to the video store and rent 10 videos. But while they were renting the 10 videos, they felt compelled to tell the person at the cash register that they were renting 10 videos because they were going into quarantine because they were exposed to SARS. And the people in the stores were in a panic about what do they do now, and are they at risk? And we have developed now a mechanism for all the related people asking questions and getting answers quickly, and being educated as well, because it turns out that everybody needs information, and it's a matter of how you get the questions asked. But we paid really close attention, because we knew the SARS virus got into nursing homes. The mortality rate among elderly people with medical complications was nearly 90%. And if it got into a nursing home, we figured that it would be wildly devastating.
Another question here?
Yes, Dr. Young. You mentioned that teens in particular were non-compliant regarding the quarantine, and you just mentioned again about an individual, you know, who may have gone to the video store. How were you able to track these non-compliant individuals? How did you know they were not following the quarantine directives?
What we did was we set up a system after they were quarantined that they were phoned on a twice daily basis. We kept track of them, and we paid attention to what questions they asked and what questions, when we asked, how their responses were, and got a sense from that as to whether or not they were complying or not. The kids were, we were getting reports from other citizens that some of the kids weren't complying. Fortunately, it was a situation where they were in the last day or so of their quarantine. None of them had shown up, and it looked really like it was probably, they'd been quarantined for, with a minimum of need, so it was not a situation we were overly worried about. If it had been, I think we literally would have gone to the mall and gone and picked them up there and returned them home, but or another time, I guess the other way is to rent a warehouse and put a bunch of video stuff in and hold them in there and feed them pizza all day, but but it is a real problem. But we found that public pressure really kept people, the more they understood and the more they were worried about spreading it, the better the compliance was. But you have to worry about things, particularly in elderly people, like how do people who live alone walk their dogs? And what if they need medications? And what if they have to go to a medical appointment and it's an emergency? Who takes them and how are they protected, and how do you manage them within the healthcare system when they walk in? So the numbers of problems, and we were talking about during the break language. We have a hugely diverse population in Toronto, and public health has to deal in something like 80 languages on a regular basis. So they were all kinds of problems as well.
Dr. Young, could you say a little bit more about how you supported people while they were at home in quarantine in terms of food, medication? I think we've thought about how we would do a wide-scale quarantine, and that's one of the issues that always comes up. Who is public health responsible for ensuring that people get food and medication, or how did you work that?
Public health, Toronto Public Health were at the center of it, but I think what you realize is the public health units begin to get overly busy, and if it's an area that someone else can look after and leave them for their area of expertise, you're better to do that. So we used Meals on Wheels, and we used volunteer groups, and what we would say to them is, look at, just drop the stuff at the door and someone else can, and then they can pick it up from there. But we set up numbers for them to call and tell us what they needed. So if they needed medications, we had a system in place that their medications would be delivered. If they needed food, then food. Many of the people had relatives who could do that, but if they didn't, you do have to set up a system. But I would really advise, we said to Toronto, put your full operations center in place and get police, fire, ambulance, administration doing some of these tasks, and don't have public health doing things that they don't have to do, because they've got lots of tracking and phoning. We kept trying to get them to not do all the phone calls, but they argued back to us that the phone calls were important because people would want to ask questions. And so we considered doing a sort of a filtering system where if they didn't ask a question, then it could be someone else. But as far as actually making the calls, we left it more or less to public health.
So if people needed food or medication, there was a number to call that would then get it into the system if they didn't have relatives or whatever.
Exactly, and interestingly, we also, in those SARS hospitals that were closed, we had to have medical staff working, but they were in quarantine, so they would work all day in gowns and gloves and masks, and then they would go home, and at night they were in quarantine. So what we did in those places was we set up grocery stores in the hospitals, and we set up gas bars, and they filled their car at the hospital at the gas bar, and then we ran sort of butler services for them. If they had cleaning or something, they dropped it off. Hospital sent it out and got it done and returned it. After SARS, they wanted it all to continue, of course. But
I think just one other quick comment. The compensation that system you put in place was probably key. We've also struggled with how people would react to being cut off from their salary or whatever if they had to stay home, and I think that's a key element. Just curious how you managed to get that to happen, and how you mentioned an easy application process to get that.
Yeah, the key to the compensation was getting the government to move fast, and of course the first day I mentioned it to the Premier, he said, well, why isn't it running through unemployment insurance, which is a federal program? And I said, well, Premier, have you ever dealt with the federal government? He said, yes, my whole career. And I said, how long do you think it'll take them to decide whether they cover this? He said, likely about 2 more careers. And I said, well, I'm not sure we can wait, so I think we have to do something about this. And the people who most need it are the people who, we all live hand to mouth, but some of us live even more hand to mouth than others. And so the amount of money, in fact, we could almost fully compensate the most needy among us and reassure them then that they would be paid almost their full wages. So the next day the Premier came and said, yes, we've discussed it among ourselves and we'll pay for it and we'll worry about who pays for it afterwards. And then we announced it and we said, literally you will need very little paperwork to collect it. You'll be able to simply indicate who you were exposed to and who told you to be quarantined, and that's enough to get you paid, and that worked. It's very, very important, and we're saying to the government now, if you're dealing with these things, it's not part of recovery, it's part of the management of an emergency to have compensation worked out in advance. If you're dealing with avian flu, if you can't tell farmers at the beginning what you're going to pay for the birds and how you're going to do it, you're going to have them hiding the birds from you, and you're going to have the spread continue. So part of the management of these things is deciding these things well in advance, and you actually in the end save money by being aggressive at the beginning and being able to manage it.
As much as we like to poke fun at our governmental structures here in the States, I mean, New York did something similar after 9/11 with their emergency Medicaid system, and very rapidly, I don't know how that was decided to be done, but very rapidly created a 1-page or 2-page form for Medicaid applications for people in the impacted area around the Twin Tower disaster, and I'm sure many of you have seen the charts of Medicaid enrollment just spiking right afterwards. Virtually no questions asked, you need help, you got it, and we'll deal with it later. And I assume that was another case of we'll figure out who's going to pay for it later on. Dr. Cherry, the couple things that have been said made me think of your veterinary specialty a little bit. Number one, the hiding the birds comment that Dr. Young just made, and also the walking of dogs. And people concerned about pets and the possible transmission through pets and the animals going back and forth across borders. And so did you have those issues to confront here in New York, or your colleagues elsewhere?
Yeah. Interestingly, there were very few inquiries that came up at all regarding SARS in animals and pets in this country. It wasn't actually until some time later, if you remember, there was an article that was published in Nature in October that talked about cats and ferrets being infected in the laboratory, and they could actually spread the disease. Cats did not show any clinical illness, ferrets did, so some concern there. So we didn't have any questions, but we've had a lot of discussion, unfortunately I don't think enough, as to how we might address this. I guess a question I have for you, Dr. Young, is first, whether that was ever an issue, whether animal questions came up during the Toronto experience, and second, if it were to happen that some animal was involved, and most of the animals that have been somewhat implicated have been non-agricultural species, it begs the question, as it does here, which agency, who would end up addressing those animals?
The animal question came up, not seriously, but it did along with terrorism. You know, in the early days, one of the early questions was, could this be bioterrorism? One of the other questions is, do we have animals that we have to pay attention to? And we surveyed that and we paid attention. The potential spread came up even more than that. At one point, we were trying to reassure manufacturers. There were some countries were refusing goods that were manufactured in Ontario because they would think that the SARS virus would spread on you know, a toaster made in Ontario or something. So it starts to affect absolutely everything within your economy, and you have to do a lot of education to people further out as well for that reason. What we would do, in fact, if we thought there was an animal problem, our Ministry of Agriculture, along with the federal, the Food Inspection Agency in Canada, deals with animal outbreaks. But what we've done in the since SARS, is we've had an extensive number of meetings and agreed on how to co-manage these things together, and we signed recently an agreement, and it's not just between the agriculture, but it's with my area of government as well. So there's a recognition that these things get very broad very quickly, and they have to be managed at multiple levels of government. So 2 weeks from now, I'm going to Vancouver to work on the avian flu in BC with the federal government and our perspective on that. So that's the kind of thing that we're doing, is we're paying a lot more attention to these things and working together.
Yeah, I think, one of the interesting things that I got from your presentation during the broadcast and from the discussion here, whether or not SARS itself is going to be direct zoonotic transmission from animals to people is a real question, and whether it happens or not is somewhat irrelevant to the broader issue, which is that this brings to mind several issues that come up if we have SARS or avian flu or any other animal source disease that is directly spread to people. And the first is infection control. I think we saw that with SARS, the difficulties we had in keeping healthcare workers from getting infected. You can imagine what would happen if we had this as a direct zoonotic transmission. So we have veterinary workers, we have farmers, we have people who have their pets, and all of those have to be addressed. Another major issue comes with diagnostics, and you talked about the difficulty with diagnostics, and then you play that back into animals where we don't have a good system for getting animals that aren't of agricultural importance tested for anything. So if we do have a situation where animals in someone's home with SARS or someone who has avian flu become ill or become a questionable source for something, how do we get them tested? And this is a really important point for us to address here. We've been working on, but for everywhere in this country and other countries, to look at how are we going to do surveillance and testing among animals when there really isn't a dedicated system for that. And then the other issue was the whole question of quarantine and regulatory heavy-handedness, how much of it is necessary, the question of if you don't pay for the birds that you're going to slaughter because of avian flu, they're going to disappear. Well, if somebody's got a cat that the Nature article says can get infected with SARS and you want to do something with that cat, what do you do with it? If you tell them to quarantine the cat at home with the owner, you'll probably get better compliance than saying to them, we're going to have to euthanize the cat. Because again, compensation aside, you've left the realm of what's important to someone's economics and you've now put it into someone's personal life, and their pets are a lot like their family. And so anything like SARS, where there's even the implication that you could get this in the pets population, you start worrying about that problem and how do you set up that sort of a system.
Yeah, you're right. The emotional loss of the pet, does the government have some kind of responsibility to attempt to compensate people for that?
Well, and how do you compensate them? This is what we found with monkeypox last year. When you tell somebody they have to euthanize the animal, some people complied, some people refused and had to go into court, and other people made the animals disappear. I think we have to keep that in mind, that it will happen.
Right. In the back.
Jumping to the macro on that, we found that one of the big issues of SARS was the head-on collision between public health and trade and investment. China, to protect its trade, would not release information. Canada was more open and got hit with a WHO sanction. And in the future, it appears that it may be a big issue about the conflicting desires of health people versus trade people. And comments from anybody on where this is going and how we might solve it?
I would start by saying we have to seriously address this, and that's part of the reason that I say SARS is not just a health issue. It very quickly becomes everything in government issue at multiple levels of government. And if you're going to deal with any infectious outbreak, you have to recognize you ultimately have to pay for it. And so the economy and the effect of the economy and the effect on tourism and the effect on trade becomes very significant very early, and your place in the world becomes very important. I think the lesson out of SARS with the WHO was that it was an interesting scientific idea, and it was well-meaning, but they didn't have the staff, we didn't have the definitions. It was really a dismal failure. And I was in Asia when they got hit with the travel advisories as well, and you could shoot a cannon through the airports in Hong Kong and Beijing and Taiwan during that time, and their trade just absolutely dropped off because of it. And that the inadvertent result of that is you may drive the thing underground, and you may and you're certainly hurting the economy and their ability to manage it in developing countries. So I think we got to. The problem has been in the past that we've tended to look at these things and think of them as only a health issue or only a this issue, and the approach really has to be much more, what's the effect on all segments and how do we link it together, and how do we do the best job of paying attention to all of the segments at once. So that's really, the WHO can't be acting in isolation, that it's just a health problem, because it's not.
We were chatting earlier that I had a little personal experience with the convention business impact in Toronto, because my wife was going to an international library conference that was scheduled for Toronto, and they said, well, you sent one of your folks down to the headquarters in Chicago to brief them ahead of time, try to persuade them it was okay, and then you yourself went and gave a session at the conference. So my wife, said she got a great hotel room at a very low rate, but it was...
Yeah, we estimated that our loss in tourism was $1 billion, and our loss in business was over $1 billion as well, and it cost us somewhere around $900 million to manage it in the healthcare system as well. So it was an enormous economic blow, and we managed it quite quickly. It could have been even worse if it went on, which is part of the reason that I advocate managing it very aggressively very early, because the sooner you do that, the less the damage, both human and economic.
Question back here?
Yes, hi, how are you? I'm a cultural anthropologist, and 2 summers ago I did some research in Boston, Chinatown, at the height of the SARS scare, at least in Boston, because it wasn't quite there yet. But it was interesting when you brought up what sort of information provided to the non-Asian community about the Asian community to sort of stave off any sort of racist issues that may have come up. Within Chinatown, it seemed like the faith-based organizations were doing a very good job of providing information to the Chinese themselves. The Chinese Christian churches, the YMCAs within the Chinatown community. But interestingly, within the Chinatown community, there was a division within the Chinese population itself with regard to the older immigrants versus the newer immigrants and who was more hygienic, et cetera. I was wondering what sort of information had been provided to the non-Asian community to help alleviate the fears that this was a Chinese disease, and was any information provided to the Chinese, and through what avenues was that done?
The Chinese community is very large in Toronto, and it's very vibrant. It's also culturally thrives on rumor. So we recognize that. I actually have 2 of my senior assistants are Chinese, so they read the Chinese newspapers for me every day and told me what the rumors were, which was really very helpful. And sometimes they were right and sometimes they weren't, but I often knew what was happening in China a day or 2 before the WHO confirmed it, because the Chinese newspapers had picked it up. Toronto Public Health worked very closely with the Chinese community. We worked closely at the provincial level. We made a point of going out every day and talking about viruses not understanding race, that viruses go right across the board. We made a point of talking about head-on about the worry that we had that this would cause cultural problems and that it was racially discriminating, and we did it, and we had the politicians do it head-on every day, and it diminished, but initially out of fear and ignorance it was a problem. We translated the materials into multiple languages, not just Chinese, and the reality in the end that the Chinese community actually was not the hardest hit from SARS. It was, there were a couple of other groups that were actually statistically harder hit, so including the group that were the religious community. So, but it took a lot of work to do it.
What have you learned that we should know in preparing for an avian flu pandemic?
First of all, we're extremely respectful of avian flus and very worried about them. We're monitoring, as I mentioned this morning, on a daily basis because we're watching what's going on in Asia. And last year it was, I believe, 37 cases and 24 deaths. There's 9 new cases this fall and 8 deaths, and it's all H5. And you look at over the last few years, the number of outbreaks of H5 are increasing, and the death toll from them is increasing. Right now in Thailand, last week, they were looking at whether or not there was human-to-human transmission in one family where a mother, a daughter, and a sister of the mother had all died, and whether or not they in fact had exposure on a farm to chickens. So that we are really very, very concerned about that and what's happening there, and the efforts to cull the animals is not succeeding there. We had the further experience of an H7, which supposedly was not very dangerous to humans in British Columbia, and started off as what's called a low pathogen type, but over the course of one weekend went from one barn to the other barn and turned from low pathogen to high pathogen and mutated. And it seems to me that even though it may not normally not be of great risk, it only takes one combination with one human virus like the SARS did to change and become a problem. So we've decided to be extremely aggressive with any avian flu and any outbreak, and to pay very, very close attention to the human side. So the first thing we do is shut a farm down and put everybody in gowns and gloves and masks, begin to watch people and put them on flu shot and Tamiflu, and we're really very concerned about the public side, the risk, and that the next pandemic may come from an avian flu in Asia, if not this one, then one soon. And we're gearing up our plans, and assuming that may happen, we're looking at vaccine sources. We have supplies of gowns and gloves and masks for 3 months now for the hospitals. So we're probably a little hyper, but it'll serve us better if and when something happens.
I would echo the concern about flu, not just avian flu, but whatever the next pandemic strain is. And I think this whole SARS episode provides us with a lot of lessons that we can apply. There are some differences with flu. Hopefully we'll have a vaccine coming if a pandemic erupts. We also have antivirals, as Dr. Young mentioned. But on the other hand, flu is probably more contagious person to person, and the measures of isolation and quarantine may be less effective unless really applied much more stringently. SARS turned out to be very communicable in some settings, perhaps not so much in others. Flu is probably more reliably contagious, and so the concern is that we could have a SARS-like situation that would be difficult to control even with the public health measures. So vaccine would be the ultimate control if you could get one. So a lot of good lessons. I think also the awareness in the healthcare community about infection control and precautions. It's, I think, much more, Dr. Treiner may want to comment, but much more common now to have signs in the entranceways and emergency rooms, to put masks on patients with respiratory symptoms, regardless of what's is circulating in the community. So much more routine infection control practice is happening, we think, in the healthcare system, and a lot of it derives from the experience in Toronto.
Maybe I could just add a couple of things that came to mind with those comments. One is we have a program, and have had for the last 3 or 4 years, of buying massive amounts of flu vaccine, and we buy 5 million doses for a population of 13 million. We give it to everyone free, and if people will take it and the uptake's greater, we'll buy more in future years. The ideal, in our government's opinion, is that we would immunize everyone every year. And
I think we're moving in that direction in this country. With this, we have a glitch this year. I hope Chiron,
Yes,
Chiron is not your supplier.
No,
of
it isn't.
vaccine.
We're Pasteur and a Canadian company.
Yep.
The second thing we recognize, though, is that the antivirals are great, but they're all manufactured in Europe, and they're very expensive, and you can't store very many of them, and it's 10 doses. So they're not the answer long-term.
They're not the answer, correct. I would agree.
And the other thing, though, that we have done is we've already put out at least 5 or 6 notices to all of the hospitals about the avian flu and what's happening. And with that is a surveillance tool and a set of questions that everyone has asked. If they come into the emergency department and they have flu-like symptoms, there's a full screening that goes on in the hospital. Similarly, if someone develops a fever within hospital, the surveillance tool is used on everyone they're isolated with a gown and glove and mask, and the surveillance tool is used until it's proven that they don't have an avian flu, or particularly if they've been anywhere in the world where that's a problem, then that causes an immediate set of reactions within to try to capture it at the beginning.
Well, then I guess if I may interject, I'd have to ask you, how compliant do you think your healthcare providers are in fulfilling that screening tool?
Actually, they are. We had an alarm last week. Had a family come from Vietnam. Mother came in sick. Turned out 2 of the kids were sick. The family was quarantined while we ran all of the lab tests. They turned out to have an influenza A, but they were caught in the screening tool at the emergency as they came in the door. So far, I think it's actually being followed.
Having the knowledge I do of emergency departments and somewhat of Canadian departments as well, you may know about the ones where it is working, but I would venture to say that you may have a little harder time knowing about the ones that you're not screening adequately. And I guess a word of case screening as it pertains to emergency departments and hospital departments. And the SARS experience really, I think, highlighted this. And that was once a patient might show up at their primary care provider or an urgent care center with fever, cough, and the headline was dominated by SARS. So it was once, oftentimes, go home, you're going to get better, a little chicken soup, or more likely, go home, take this high-priced macrolide, which won't affect what you're doing. Now became, you need to go to the emergency department and get a chest x-ray, because the chest x-ray was required for case screening. So what I think some of us felt on the healthcare delivery side was that was taking this population of patients, many of whom were very unlikely to have the illness, but if they were to have the illness, it took them right to the epicenter of transmission. And our emergency department somewhat became flooded with that particular issue. And I wonder if you would, or any of the...
Yeah, what we did, you're absolutely right, and that was a problem in the definition and in the disease. What we did in Toronto, in fact, was we set up SARS screening clinics instead. And in some of the cases, they were near the hospital, but we took a Sally Port, for example, at North York General, and we physically constructed a SARS screening unit within it, and with negative pressure rooms, and we had the flow in. You went in one door, you came out the other door. When you were waiting in the waiting area, the chairs were far enough apart that you couldn't spread the disease. Everyone was in gowns and gloves and masks. A portable x-ray had been moved out there so that, in fact, you couldn't go into the hospital till you had been through, until it was felt that it was safe. So if anybody had SARS-like symptoms, they were told to go to a SARS screening hospital, not to a general hospital. If they did show up at the emerge, everybody was already in gowns and gloves and masks, and they got sent over to one of those units instead, for that very reason, to keep the x-rays out of the unaffected hospitals.
We talked briefly, you mentioned the quarantine and case tracking or isolations in New York during the SARS outbreak, and I wish you could talk a little bit about that, and also how prepared is our structure, public health structure, governmental structure, to handle something that the preemptive closure of hospitals that they did in Toronto, to say, okay, we're just going to no elective admissions. I don't mean closure of hospitals, but everything except emergency cases. Is that a possible step in New York State, given the current laws? And
I
structures?
think it is a possible step. In fact, during flu season and flu outbreaks, if we're having a flu outbreak at a nursing home, it's common to stop admissions to the home while the outbreak's in progress. So I don't know that whether a legal mechanism has to go through, but we basically ask the home not to accept admissions. And I think there may be circumstances where that has happened in hospitals. I don't know for sure, but I think it certainly is possible if you believe you're having transmission in the facility or have a lot of exposed individuals who may be becoming ill to stop routine functioning. In the anthrax situation with the Manhattan Eye, Ear, and Throat Hospital was actually closed. The city health department asked them to close. That's a hospital that's primarily based on day stays and elective surgery. There are a few patients that spend the night, but for a brief period, they stopped their elective surgery, which essentially shut down most of what they were doing at the hospital for a few days. So we have precedent for those sorts of actions.